I, Thomas Datro, do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the State of California against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the State of California. 19 years ago, I read that oath when I first started my journey in policing. I stood up in a class, I raised my right hand with my classmates, and we all recited it. And I have never once referred to it since that one day. I never thought about it. And quite frankly, I forgot that I did it until I was reminded by my guest, Arif Alarcon. In this upcoming podcast, you're going to hear Arif and I speak about constitutional policing and the importance of the adherence to the Constitution and the implementation of the Constitution, what it stands for, what it represents, the role of the people, the role of police, and how the Constitution defines policing. I just thought it'd be interesting to read that so you have some reference and some scales. So that podcast is coming up next, and I hope you enjoy it. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Policing in America podcast. Hello, everybody, and thank you again for tuning into the Policing in America podcast. I have with me today an alumni of the Season 1 Policing in America podcast, Arif Alarcon. You may know Arif, I'm sure, if you listen to my show, because it was the most listened to podcast I have. So with that, I wanted to bring him in again. We've developed a friendship, and we talk a lot outside of the podcast via text message and over the phone. And I just wish sometimes I could be recording it, because I think everybody who listens to the show would get a lot out of it. So just as a quick little bio, Arif is the president and chief legal counsel for TechLogix. Prior to that, though, he had a distinguished 25-year career with the U.S. Department of Justice, the Department of Homeland Security, and the City of Los Angeles. Arif is a recognized expert on policing, Homeland Security, counterterrorism. If you have a solid 5 minutes, head over to TechLogix.com, TACLOGIX.com, where you could read all about Arif and his bio, and you can see all the amazing work that he's done. Arif, thank you so much again for being here.
Tom, thank you for having me again. I'm really flattered that you invited me back. I've always enjoyed our conversations, and I certainly enjoyed our first go around on this. So thanks so much for having me.
Pat, that's nice of you to say. So in the upcoming weeks, I have a guest coming on. He's Professor Peter Moskos, Moskos. He's out of John Jay College, Criminal Justice. And he just penned an article that was put into the Wall Street Journal, and it's titled "The Murder Spike of 2020 When Police Pull Back." And the subtitle is this, and I kind of wanted to see what you thought of this. The criminologist who argues that last year's unprecedented rise in killings was the result of treating policing as the problem rather than an essential part of public safety. And I know you and I have often talked about what's wrong with policing and what can we fix about policing. And I think what Professor Moskos postulates, and I think what you and I have been talking about are, there's some things we do right as well. It's not just this broken, dysfunctional system. While there are elements that certainly need to be addressed, some more than others, depending on your perspective. But I was hoping maybe you would talk to myself and the audience about some of the things you think police is doing right, or at least trending in the right direction.
Sure. I think there are many things that policing is doing right. There are many things that need improvement. We talked about a few of those in your first season. I do think, though, just to get directly to, I think the point that Professor Moskos is making is that we often want to discount things that maybe the controversy or the aspect of something we don't like, and we want to then say the solution is someplace else. That's the basic binary bias that I think is afflicting us a lot, which is it's either this or that. I just kind of, just from my own experience, and I think just anybody who's been dealing either operationally like I have on complex social issues like crime and Homeland Security, but I also just think, sophisticated researchers and others would attest, is that these are complex problems, and you can't attribute any cause to one single or even two factors. I don't subscribe to the idea that policing doesn't matter. And I think that's what troubles me, is this idea that it's of no consequence whatsoever, and maybe just backfiring on everything. Now, there's no doubt that policing could backfire. It could create conditions that would actually make crime more prevalent. And of course, if there's lawlessness by the officers themselves, that's completely unacceptable. But I think we have to recognize that policing is a factor, sometimes good, sometimes bad, but certainly is there. And to completely eliminate it doesn't make any sense. But I think we have to recognize there are many other factors that go into, and the factors differ from city to city, from state to state, from neighborhood to neighborhood. And we have to recognize that there's a complexity to this, especially if you want to try to address these issues of crime, of policing issues, of community issues, and be very specific about it and be much more nuanced. But I think you and I have talked about this. We've lost that sense of balance. We've lost that sense of it either has to be this or that. And we see that afflicting law enforcement as well.
One thing I'd like to ask you about with that is this idea. I've since tried to memorize this phrase, the binary bias we have. This kind of like zero sum, like it's this or nothing. And then it's like the binary result. Like if you don't believe in what I believe, you're discounted entirely. Mm-hmm. You know, my whole body of work with sleep deprivation. In certain circles, that's just completely disregarded, even though Harvard School of Medicine, calls this a problem in public safety. One thing, if we could try to parse this out a little bit, as I took some notes, policing could be the problem. There's good and there's bad, but what tends to happen is police officers tend to bear the brunt of this. Mm-hmm. And there are good police officers, there are bad police officers. How can we help to start shaping this conversation so that when somebody like ex-police officer, now convicted felon Derek Chauvin, does something, it doesn't blow back on people in Los Angeles or Chicago or New York? Like, that is one instance. How can we start parsing this out a little bit and say, sure, policing is a profession, but not every officer is certainly not every officer is doing that, or else it'd be much more chaotic out there.
Right. And I think that goes to the whole discussion. Is it an outlier? Is it one bad apple? And why is it that we take one incident that, empirically you could say is not as prevalent as maybe the narrative is, and blame it on other agencies? I think that's what you're sort of getting at. So I think there are two factors that come into that. One is, even though it may not be true that an incident like that could even happen in another city, it still represents in many ways policing, because policing represents us. It's our government, it's our country, it's our nation. And policing is an extension of all of that in terms of exercising the enforcement power that we as a society give police officers. It's not it is not, and it shouldn't be, something completely separate. Now, with that in mind, so that means that when you see a police officer anywhere do something that is wrong, it is reflective on us as a society. It's hard to say, well, no, that was in a different state or a different department, and it's not us. It shouldn't be blamed on everybody. Well, of course, it shouldn't be blamed on everybody. And I don't think people seriously think that, let's say, for example, what happened in Minneapolis is representative of 18,000 police departments and hundreds of thousands of police officers. But it still has a very significant symbolic aspect to it. And it should cause concern if we are truly trying to be one society, one democratic society, and have that application. I also think, though, too, that policing and police agencies, and I consider myself part of that in the law enforcement community, we sometimes do ourselves a disservice because we talk about police officers as all being part of this culture, this brotherhood, this fraternal order. We talk about all cops, or cops think this and think that. So there is this sense of, well, police, they're very tight. They're very, connected. Oftentimes they circle the wagons. They do all these things. So the way even police officers and police agencies talk about it, it's as if everybody is part of the same family. Well, guess what? When one of your family members does something, that represents the entire family. And so I think that feeds into it as well. But I think the bigger point is that whether it's in Ferguson, whether it's in Minneapolis, whether it's elsewhere, it's still representative of our government and our police and our country doing something and somebody doing something that's wrong. And I think it's hard to completely say disassociate that, especially when we're trying to talk about we're one society and what it represents. I mean, it gets into, and I know we'll talk a little bit about this whole concept of constitutional policing. And I think that's kind of the rub that we're in.
Yeah. Yeah. There's so much. I wrote a lot down as you were talking. And one thing it is one government. It is one nation. You know, it's in our songs, it's in our pledges, but we are, I believe it's like that federalist type of structure, right? Indiana is very different than California. We have different legislatures. And so even though there is this sort of nationalistic pride as to being an American, there's also the pride in being a Southside Chicagoan and being a Southern Californian as opposed to a Northern Californian. And so because we also have these tribal mentalities as well, I think that's where it starts to get tough when you have agencies like some of the big three or the big five that have been implementing changes and really trying and sometimes failing, but for no lack of effort. Procedural justice now is common terminology in a lot of police agencies. As were 3 years ago, command staff wouldn't even know what this is. As we're now, your basic probationer knows what this means. So we're making strides.
Yeah, and
But
I think that,
go ahead.
I'm sorry, I think that's true. But I think one thing, just to add on to the point we were talking about, is that you and I know there are 18,000 police departments. You and I know that every department is very different in terms of its training, its service, its quality of officers, and all the different things that matter in how police service is provided or not provided, or how police powers can be abused or abided by. Most people don't. Most people don't, and nor should they, understand those complexities in the way that I think sometimes police officers or those of us in law enforcement expect them to. So do they know that in Los Angeles alone, there are so many police departments that are responsible for the jurisdiction, from the LAPD to the LA Airport Police to the Port Police to the Sheriff's Department to CHP? No, of course not. It's all the same. And in many ways, it should be the same, because they all wear a badge that represents not just their agency and their jurisdiction, but the government of the people. And I don't think we can disassociate that in terms of the symbolic nature of somebody abusing that trust. Now, I agree, we cannot take one incident and condemn an entire profession. That is not the right thing to do. But I also understand the impact that can have. And I think policing has to recognize the impact that has on society, and especially people in society who don't see that as an isolated incident, because they've seen other things very personally that further, it's not that one incident, it's what that incident represents, and maybe in their own experiences that many of us have not been exposed to.
Yeah, when I have this conversation with my young officers, I try to rally them because I don't want the morale to just continue to spiral. And I say, typically, gang, these instances are the straw that breaks the camel's back. And it's a combination of just trauma and disappointment and frustration, and it builds and it builds and it builds. And then you have a flashpoint, and then everyone says enough. And if you've seen the documentary Let It Fall in Los Angeles, it wasn't Rodney King per se. It was everything leading up to that. And that was it. It was like this, the structure could not hold anymore. The structure holding up society broke.
And I think that point is very well taken, but I think you can attribute that whole idea to almost every significant police abuse that has gained notoriety, whether it's Ferguson, whether it's Laquan McDonald in Chicago, whether it's Rodney King in Los Angeles. It's not that one incident is that significant, very large, heavy straw that broke a back that has been loaded up over a lot of time. And we have to remember that it's not, that's where I think we have to be very careful about saying it's an isolated incident, it's a bad apple, because there is a lot more to it than just on the individual level.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm looking it up right now. You may have heard about the book called The Lucifer Effect. Is that okay? So this is a Philip Zimbardo. Philip Zimbardo wrote a book called The Lucifer Effect, and he completely runs contrary to the narrative of just one bad apple. And what he postulates is it's not a bad apple, it's a bad barrel. And there are certain apples that press up against the barrel that make them bad, if to draw the analogy a little bit out. And
Sure.
if that barrel were spread out, if that barrel were set up a different way, you wouldn't have bad apples. And
Hmm.
so he talked about this in general, it wasn't his policing. And so I thought, how interesting, because there is some downward pressure for numbers in policing and CompStat. And how do we define quality policing? What is a good cop? You
Right.
know, I think if you got 10 people in a room and they were from various agencies, they were from various units, you ask a SWAT cop, you ask a senior lead officer, ask a gang officer, ask a community activist, what's a good cop? I'm thinking you're going to get some pretty different answers.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that comes to the fundamental question of, and I think this right now we're at a crossroads where we really have to define what is it that we want policing to be and do and represent. And I think a lot of times when we're talking about, well, what's wrong, what do we need to do to fix policing, we don't ask the question,
Right.
what do we want policing to do? I think, and it comes down to just, I think that what we expect as a society, what we have as a foundation, our Constitution and our democratic form of government, the policing really boils down to, and the question should be, is policing reducing crime, protecting communities, and pursuing justice as the essential things? Because I think that is the expectation of the vast majority of people. We have police because we hope it's reducing crime, meaning that there's some deterrent effect by having police officers out there, that there is some lawful, reasonable efforts to prevent crimes from happening, whether it's people with illegal guns or somebody who is threatening someone to be able to take actions to prevent it from further harm. Protecting communities just in general, whether it's from traffic collisions or from other factors, or whether it's just people who are trying to get together for a concert, those types of things. We expect police officers to protect that from potential harm. And then the other aspect is, I think, unfortunately, is lost or is getting lost in the discussion, is pursuing justice. And it's not just racial justice. I think that is something that it is the obligation of a government society to pursue and correct the historical wrongs that have occurred and things that have happened in policing. But we have to remember that it's the obligation of policing in our society, in a democracy, to pursue justice for other victims of the actual crimes. And those are cases where the crime has already been committed, where somebody has been harmed. And the only way in a democratic society is to make sure we have a proper and fair investigation, that the criminal justice system operates as it's always intended to be. It doesn't always do that. And making sure that people are held to account for harming another person. I think that's an obligation that we often forget, which of course is rooted in a democracy, because we don't want people to pursue their own individual justice. So without those, to me, those are the kind of core things that I think most people would generally agree that that's what we want. We want a police department, policing to reduce crime, protect communities, all members of the community, and pursue justice in a lawful and fair and manner that we have come to expect as Americans.
You've been doing this for multiple decades, and you've seen it at various levels. Unlike, say, a patrol cop, they only see it from one perspective. You've seen it on a variety. You're actually a reserve officer yourself. So are police doing those three things? Are they reducing crime, protecting communities, and pursuing justice?
I think to varying degrees. I think the problem is we expect them to do it alone, or we expect policing to solve these problems. And we sometimes have mixed messages about what we actually want them to do. I mean, it goes to a deeper issue. Are we structured for pursuing these goals? Are we getting the right people? Are we giving the right incentives to pursue all of these things? And I think that varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And I think there's a lot to say that there's a lot of evidence to say, no, we're not doing that in the same way, or certainly consistently. And I think that's part of the frustration that many people have. But I do want to say that these three goals have to be done effectively, as opposed to just efficiently. Sometimes we think, well, reducing crime, well, we're efficient because we're going in and we're clearing off corners and we're making arrests and doing that. That's not effective. And the reason why it's not effective is because the one other aspect to this I didn't mention, we want to reduce crime, protect communities, and pursue justice, but it has to be consistent and have the legitimacy, but it has to be consistent with our democratic values that are rooted in the Constitution, that are expected by all. So I think that's where the rub comes. We think that, well, we have to do all this stuff because we have to fight crime. And somehow it's inconsistent with, you know, the things that are in the Constitution, the restrictions, the expectations, the rules, the principles. And that's where I think we go wrong. It's sort of this discussion I've been having a lot, and the pressures just from police chiefs and others who are under it saying, you know, we have to, you know, reform is great. We want to do reform, but we can't do reform when we have people dying in the streets. And I understand that sentiment, and reform being we need to improve our accountability, our transparency, our community relations, all those things. I understand that dichotomy once again, right? It's a bias of either this or that. But the reality is they're interconnected. You cannot be an effective police department in America if you are trying to reduce crime, you're saying you're protecting communities, or you're pursuing justice, which is maybe sometimes street justice, if it's completely contrary to our democratic values and constitutional principles. They are interconnected. And I also think that is, if you look at evidence, if you look at it's a way to be an effective police department, coming back to that. When you have all of that, it's trust. It goes to, you know, something we've talked about before. I call it the 3 dimensions of effective policing. And if you like, we can talk about that a little bit.
Absolutely. And for the fellow academics listening, because I have a few, I love that you use efficient and effective, because managers are efficient, right? And leaders are effective. Managers do things right, leaders do the right things. And so it is very telling that you use very specific wording for this, because a lot of people right now feel that, and I'm just echoing statements that I talk to hundreds of police officers, that's what's lacking. We have tons of managers in policing. We have very little leaders. Right. Very few leaders. So please go a little bit further, though, into that dimension you're talking about.
Sure. And just something on that point, you know, it goes beyond, you're absolutely right. We want effective leaders. But even it comes down to, what are the metrics we're using to evaluate policing? What are the metrics we're using to manage policing? You know, there's been a trend over the last 20, 30 years to use metrics like CompStat and crime numbers and those types of things, which is very important. I mean, you have to have some quantitative data to see, has there been an effect? Are we doing the things that we say we're supposed to be doing in terms of enforcing the law or trying to prevent things from happening? But it misses the qualitative aspect of, well, ultimately, is it effective? Are we seeing the forest through the trees? Are we actually achieving our objectives in a way that has the legitimacy and can be sustained? And that's a harder question. But I think that's where the whole issue of the breakdown in trust, et cetera. We know there are many countries out there who know how to just completely shut down any potential for crime. But that's not consistent with America and our values in a democracy. And that's maybe a very efficient way of doing it, but certainly is not going to be effective in maintaining what we stand for and what police officers are expected to represent. So I appreciate you kind of recognizing that, because I think that's very important. So here's my kind of thing. It just, from all the discussions, especially now, I'm thinking about this. I'm not an academic like you. I have taught, but I'm a policy person, and oftentimes I'm trying to think of, how do you take policy ideas and, you know, fuse thought with action, because that's what policy is. And I think the framing that I've thought about is this idea of 3 dimensions. I think there are 3 dimensions to effective policing in America. And I say America because we're talking about policing in our structure and our values and those types of things. And it really comes down to this. The first part is, I think the first dimension has to be about the law and the Constitution. Because the law and the Constitution defines our democracy. It defines the role of police officers and policing in general in our entire system, in our checks and balances, in its branch of being in the executive branch, whether it's at the federal level or however it's structured in the state or local level, to fairly and effectively enforce the law and justly enforce the law. And everything is rooted in the Constitution in the United States, in our state constitutions, in our city charters, and then, of course, what the laws are that can be enforced and how it can be enforced. And that's so important as just the foundation to which we have to understand that that's the expectation of police officers do. And it's the expectation of the public who really, I don't care, my family came to the United States, they're immigrants. These are the kinds of things that people think about is the U.S. Constitution and the rights and the privileges afforded to people, but also the concept of fairness and the rule of law, because that doesn't exist in many parts of the world. So I think that is a really important dimension, which is what I call the law and the Constitution as that foundation. The second part of the dimension is the people, the role of the people or community or the public, however you want to frame it, in the effort, in the Constitution and the law, that we're supposed to be a participative government, a representative government, a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, a country of laws and not, as was said, men, but really, it's about something important in their role and that community connection. And then the third part is actually police work. When I say police work, I'm talking about the powers we vest in police officers to enforce the law fairly, to investigate crimes, to do things we don't grant the power to any other governmental entity, to stop somebody, to search them, to use force to effect an arrest, to overcome resistance or prevent escape. All of those things that we expect police officers to do because we don't want individuals to take their own actions. We do want to have something where all the things we talk about in the Constitution about justice and the rule of law, et cetera, are maintained. So when you look at those three dimensions, the law and the Constitution, the people or the community, and the police work, the actual enforcement investigation, and all of those sorts of things, to me, you have to have all three of those dimensions in order to be effective. So why does that matter? What I think is happening and what I've seen, if you look at it historically, we tend to focus on one of the three, maybe two of the three, but rarely all three things and how important and interrelated they are. So just as an example, if you look at police reform through the 50s, 60s, 70s, it was very much focused on police work. It was focused about how police were deployed, using technology, professionalizing the force, having a better trained force, being very organized, et cetera, because that wasn't it. It was about, like you were saying earlier, it was about efficiencies. Are we being efficient with these resources? Are we going out there and deploying, to deal with these issues? And there has been a lot of reform in that area, and it continues to be, especially when you get to technology, et cetera. And then there's the shift over, well, now we have to focus on the community because of the disconnect between the community and the actual police work. And I think there have been changes. I think not enough, and that's what we're here now. But the one thing I think that we don't emphasize enough is about the law and the Constitution and the concept of constitutional policing, which we can get into more detail. But the other issue, though, is just going back to the two elements of police work and the community. Once again, you have this thing that there's somehow intention, or it's either you can spend time with the community or you can do real police work, right? I'm sure you've experienced it. That's the whole approach. And once again, I think just those two dimensions not being connected and interrelated and understanding that relationship is misguided, because you have to have both in order to do your police work, but have the public trust that you're doing the right thing at the right time for the right reasons.
Do you think that framework is agile enough to be implemented? And let's use our local agency. Is this framework agile enough to be implemented and to be the guiding force of, say, mid-city, the same as it is South Los Angeles? Can this framework fit nicely, whether you're on the west side or the south side? Or do different communities demand a little bit more emphasis on one over the other?
Well, I think so. And the reason why is this kind of came to me as I'm just struggling to try to, how do we take all these things that we want and expect police officers to do, but make sense out of it all? How do you harmonize all of these things? I think these three dimensions exist. And and as I'm going out and talking to groups of officers, and I'm working with, government agencies about this concept, especially on the issue of constitutional policing, because it's a phrase without a clear understanding what it means, and something I've been very passionate about, that it's not just about don't violate the constitutional rights of people. It actually means a lot more. I do think it is. And yes, there are going to be circumstances where the role of the people needs to be emphasized because they aren't part of the other two dimensions. They're not connected. They're not afforded the accountability and transparency that we come to expect and require for all of this to work. So yeah, I do. But it's because I don't think these are foreign concepts in terms of, I think that we all kind of assume that, yeah, well, of course. But from being on the inside, and I know from my work with many different departments and being in government for 25 years, I'm not sure if we think about it this way. And I think it could help us get away from this idea that there's only a binary option. It's either we got to do real police work or we can be with the community. And that's just wrong. Now, on the Constitution and the legal part, my aspect of that is that's what ties this all together. Because constitutional policing is about the law and the Constitution, not just what it says, but what it embodies, what it inspires, what its expectations create. And then the role of policing and the role of community is defined by that. And I think that's also where we are not doing a good enough job, because I don't think we have the level of legal education, understanding of the Constitution, understanding of the laws, and especially its complexities, which turns into problems when you're actually expected to apply it in very tense and difficult circumstances.
You did something recently when you were giving a little educational class to me and some other officers, and you said, constitutional policing, and you made a really good point. You said, okay, how many of you know this Constitution? Okay, what does Article 1 say? And I paused and I thought, I have no idea. I have no idea what Article 1 says. And that's, you weren't doing it to embarrass us, but I thought, my gosh, here I am spending all this time educating myself on a number of topics. And if you look at the oath I swore on the first day, it says support and defend the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the State of California. You'd think maybe then I would have spent the next few hours learning a little bit more about this. So I'm going to make one point and then maybe you could bring this all together. So there is now a group of people, and we'll almost call them like personal auditors, watchdog groups, and they run around with cell phones and they say they're doing First Amendment audits. They're doing police audits. This just happened to me recently, and a bunch of young men ran up and they filmed me, and I did okay. I did fine. But I watched his video, and he said, you should look at my video. And so I did. I went to his YouTube, and I'll be darned if so many of us, and I'd say 90% of these videos, don't make us look good. And it's not police violence. It's just officers telling people, get that out of my face or I'm taking you to jail.
Right.
And these auditors saying, oh, please arrest me, because that's going to be a violation of my rights and the Constitution. I think we need more training in this. And so tell us a little bit on your thoughts on that.
Sure. And just to illustrate your point, what you talk about, just for your listeners to understand, when I've had the benefit of being able to train or make presentations about constitutional policing literally to thousands of officers throughout the United States. And when I get to this issue of what is constitutional policing, I always ask the question, how many of you are sworn officers? And they all raise their hand and they say, what did you swear to? It's to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of whatever state they may be in. I said, okay, great. Well, let's just do a quick overview of the Constitution, because you guys and gals swore to protect this. And you've been through the academy, all these things. So then I enter it and I study, what does Article 1 say? And there's crickets. Now, to me, it's not just about the fact that people don't know, or police officers often don't know, but it's even deeper than that. Article 1, of course, is the legislative branch, and it defines the legislative branch. Why is it important, though, that the legislative branch was Article 1? And most people don't realize that was very deliberate on behalf of the founders, the framers of the Constitution, because it was intended to say we are a government of the people, a representative democracy. And it wasn't the executive branch, which most people will respond and say that. And that was deliberate because they did not want democracy in America to be defined by a king, a queen, a leader, or even a president. It was defined that the first and most important branch of government in our system of government would be the people. And at that time, it was so revolutionary because that had not been the defining characteristic of any other country. So it goes beyond just knowing what it is, but why it is so important. So getting to your question about, so where are we on that? The reality is we do not train, educate police officers enough on some of the basic things about the Constitution. We rely on what they had in 8th grade civics. And we do not do the functional, the most important thing was keeping people apprised of the law and the complexities of the law. It is very complex. That's the nature of American law. You have the federal courts, the state courts, the districts within each courts, or the circuits within each courts, the application of things, the holdings, et cetera, et cetera. Academies are very good, and I went through the LAPD Reserve Academy, and it's one of the best academies, the experiences I think I could have ever had. But you're teaching the law in literally a couple months, and not only what the law is theoretically, but how to apply it, such that you can build an investigation to hopefully make an arrest so that a case is built to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the person is guilty of each and every element of that offense. And then it gets to, well, who are we bringing in to do that? High school graduates or GED graduates, often with little or no college education. And even if they have a college education, are they still have the skills and critical thinking that's necessary just to apply the law? And I'm only focused on that. Put aside the fact that they also have to apply that, and they have to make very consequential decisions, especially when you go to using force, and have the judgment to be able to make that decision in incredibly stressful circumstances. So I think as an institution, as an organization, policing is doing a disservice to the officers by not emphasizing the law and Constitution in a way that I think most people expect. And that's where we go wrong on so many levels.
So you've heard me make this analogy. I'm only making it again for the listeners, and so you can expand on it a little bit. I agree with you that the training that we are receiving is falling short in the desire to make us reach the standards by which we're held to. Right. So the training we're getting is not going to be enough to reach the standards that society has on the officers. So I make the analogy I got from Jocko Willink. A Navy SEAL will spend 8 months training for a 6-week deployment. And if you do the numbers on this, they say basically for every hour a SEAL is in the teams, 45 minutes are spent training, 15 minutes are spent being a SEAL, if you will. And for policing, it feels like 55 minutes are spent being an officer while 5 minutes are spent on training. We go back, we get 6 months and we're slingshot out there. And then within 24 months, we have to make sure we, learn how to do a 3-point turn again. And we know how to handcuff somebody. And, the arrest and control that we get 8 hours in 2 months. I'll talk a little bit more about that as far as a willful undertraining on something that's more common than shootings. So I draw that analogy, not just because it's military and policing and whatnot, but just to show people like you have this unrealistic expectation because of the lack of human ability at that time. But you have a better way of articulating this.
Well, I think your point is important in that in the military, they emphasize actual excellence or proficiency at a level that we don't expect in policing or we don't provide. Now, they have the benefit of having a lot of resources. We are not, and those resources enable training on a very regular basis while other soldiers, airmen, sailors are actually in the war theaters and doing that. So they're structurally different. But I think there are some things that are really important in the context of policing. and that don't necessarily have to involve the negative aspects of a military mindset and the sort of warrior mindset. And what are those? Well, the first thing is the training. We do very limited amount of training. We do it in an academy. Academies are of varying qualities throughout the United States, of varying lengths, of varying requirements, of varying graduate levels. You'd be shocked at some police departments where you get in the academy and they graduate 99% of them. I find that difficult. I find that troubling because a lot of the skills that they're teaching in academy, most people have no experience with. Shooting, arrest and control tactics, even just on that level. But we expect to have that all done in LAPD, which is 6 months. Now, LAPD does a lot of recurring training, but even then, I know there's so much appetite and yearning for more because it's just the complexities and the things that change. But I also think there's an important distinction the military has that we don't necessarily consider in policing, which is there is a difference between training and education. Training is teaching a skill. In my personal experience is that police departments are incredibly good. My experience at LAPD was, I think, amazing in training to skills, learning how to drive high speed or precision driving, was amazing. I couldn't believe how much I had improved in 4 days with the instruction and the equipment and everything. Firearms, it's the same thing. Many departments are very good at teaching those types of skills. But when it comes to the most important aspect, which is the decision making and the critical thinking, we're not. Because it's much more complex. It's much more difficult to teach those concepts and apply those concepts. And I know you've done a fantastic job in your department teaching procedural justice, but you also have a doctorate in education. You also have thought about this and you've got a good team who's able to do that. And even then, it's still challenging because of a variety of factors. But we don't value that education as much as we should. Some do, some places don't. The military does to an enormous extent. And that's something I was privileged to see because I was invited to teach at National Defense University, which is the flagship institution, the graduate institution for the Joint Chiefs and the U.S. military. And so I was working alongside colonels and flag officers who had gotten their PhDs and were engaged in teaching young officers, older officers. The expectations and the requirements are really unbelievable in terms of what the military expects from not just its leaders, but even from its enlisted officers and across the board. We don't do that in policing to the extent we need to. Like I said, the minimum qualifications in California, you have to have high school diploma or GED and a clean record. That's about it. And policing screening is all about screening people out because they may have other factors instead of screening the right people in. And the idea that we can train them, shape them, make them police officers during 6 months of training and then some on-the-job time in a field training program. The military used to do that. They don't do that now. They recruit people, even at the enlisted levels, for specific skills and capabilities and backgrounds. And in the officer levels, they screen. So your point about special operations is really important. People don't become special operators just because they want to.
Right.
They look for all of these skills and capabilities, not just the technical and the physical, but their critical thinking skills as well. We have to start doing that in policing because it's really the most important skill in policing, which is problem solving, critical thinking, and judgment. And I just don't think we are being realistic when we expect that of 21-year-olds with very little life experience, very little actual work experience, and a minimal amount of training that may be very good on the skills, but not very good or enough to certainly give somebody be able to evaluate whether they have the judgment and the critical thinking skills that are necessary for everyday police work.
I did a little experiment, unacademically rigorous on my own. We run command and control de-escalation scenarios over at an academy. And I see these all the time. And so one group was doing it, another group was sitting off to the side. And I just walked up to them and I said, "Hey gang, how's it going?" Introduced myself. And I said, "Look, give me 5 minutes. I want to just talk to you a little bit about de-escalation from the inside out." And I said, I'm kind of field testing this. And I just gave them 5 minutes on prefrontal cortex, executive function, amygdala hijacking. And I said, when they're yelling and you raise your voice, you're starting to shut this down. You're lighting your amygdala up. And the next thing you know, you're both emotionally reasoning. And it was a 5-minute little skit that I just said, now, I'm going to talk to you after your scenario. And so I watched from afar, and they did so well. Now, granted, I primed them for this, but they did so well. And then the instructors were like, wow, you guys remained really calm. You guys were just, this was very easy for you. And then afterwards, they came to me, I came to them, and I said, so what'd you think? And they said, well, it was like you gave us a cheat sheet, because none of us yelled. None of us screamed.
Right.
We started asking this person, hey, what's your name? My name's Tom. As where for some reason in policing, that's like an officer safety issue. Don't tell them your name is Tom, even though it says Datro right here, right?
Right.
Like Tom is somehow a safety issue. And they said it was just so much easier because everybody stayed calm. And even the suspect said there was nothing for them to grab onto. The cops never lost their cool. They never said anything. They just remained calm, and it really brought everything down.
Right.
And we in all this training that we do, you say the word emotional hijacking, but nobody ever says amygdala. Nobody ever says prefrontal cortex. And I just gave a little bit, and I was using visual, my hand here as opposed to the reptilian brain. And I just thought, okay, this was one little experiment with 10 officers, but maybe there's something there. Maybe our training needs to be a little more rigorous,
Right.
and a little more involved. Because didn't you say we're training the same way we did in the 50s?
In many ways, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it has evolved. I know in LAPD, it made a major shift away from, rote memorization and those types of things into actual problem solving and more critical thinking, using different decision-making models, which is great. I don't think that has necessarily been the trend everywhere. And it comes just from practical, issues. Smaller departments all pool their people, or they get people from other departments. They have opportunities to hire, and if they don't hire enough people, they're going to lose the money to hire because it may not be put in the next budget. There are a lot of these external pressures that kind of go against this. But I think the point you make is important, because I don't want to suggest in any way that the people who are in policing don't have that interest to learn things like you said. In fact, I've always been so impressed with the officers in all the departments, and especially LAPD, how much they want to know and understand. Right. I think there's a stereotype that, cops don't care, they're not going to listen. I mean, even within the departments, the crusty old guy. Yeah, there are going to be some of them. But my experience is that many of them want to learn. They want to have that. They want to be in more learning cultures, which I think is something that departments have to really think about more, is becoming a learning culture where you are trying to do new things. You're trying to look at things differently. You're trying to figure out what went right and what went wrong in that particular incident, et cetera. And there is such a yearning and appetite for that, especially among the younger officers.
Yeah.
Right. But just, it's funny because if you listen to sometimes the old timers or even some chiefs, they talk about, well, the youngins, the millennials these days or whatever, they're always questioning things, and then et cetera. And I used to say, first of all, the idea that when you were given a direction or order and you just said, yes, sir, yes, ma'am, how high can I jump? The reality is you were in the locker room and talking about, this sucks or whatever. But more importantly, I said, the reason why don't you want the officers to ask why so they understand it, and then they can be convinced of it, and they could be the ones who are telling the others why? That yearning for learning and understanding is something we should be taking advantage of, whether they're veterans or recruits, because that creates a thinking, learning culture. And I've always found, when I go and talk to officers about constitutional policing or risk management or any of these things, if you make it in a way that's engaging and relevant to them, they really want to learn, because it helps them do their jobs and do their missions. And because the vast majority of officers are really there to help protect communities. And sometimes they're not given the structure of the organization, the tools, the information, the education to pursue that goal. And I think that's just one of those structural things that we have to look at as a whole. I don't want to minimize, though, because I know some listeners may think, oh, this is being an apologist for bad behavior.
Mhm.
There is bad behavior. And I think there's
Mhm.
systemic issues in policing of not holding those people who do abuse the trust of the public in policing accountable. And they should be dealt with appropriately and sometimes severely. And it's not an excuse for any of that. But I
Right.
do think there are things we're talking about that actually can help overall to maybe avoid many of those people who have violated the trust of the public.
A few things I wanted to pull on with that because you're right. There is this yearning for learning. I like that, but there is also a culture in policing, and then you have all these subcultures. So a subculture at, I'm just naming a few divisions, like a Newton division, or say like a South End, Inglewood and Chicago division. Like those little hubs have their own subcultures, and that's that old Peter Drucker phrase, like organizational culture eats policy and strategy for lunch. How would you address, because you say you want to make this culture, how do you address something that I think is like the Kraken, like the police culture in general is this very powerful, kind of like esoteric idea that's hard to overcome.
Yeah, and I think there's some mythology to the idea that there is a police culture, because the more and more that I go to different departments, I realize there isn't. I mean, there are enough distinctions between departments and approaches and people, et cetera, that I think it's really hard to pinpoint a police culture. I mean, in general sense, of course, there's going to be something, people who are proud of wearing the badge, and at least theoretically, they're going in for noble reasons, et cetera. But we all know every organization is different. They have different pay scales, the different requirements, different training, different expectations. So there are going to be these, if you want to call them subcultures, even within the department. But even within the subcultures of a particular division or district or precinct, they're cliques and they're different things, and the detectives
Mhm.
are different than the motor officers, whatever it may be. But how do you change that? Or, I mean, this is just an organizational change concept. How do you change this culture? Well, I think culture is a function of systems, it's a function of
Mhm.
incentives, and it's a function of the people in terms of leadership, both at the top and the leadership that everybody, especially in policing, possesses or doesn't possess. So if you create a structure that incentivizes behavior that you actually say you don't want, you're going to create a culture that you don't want. The best example I when I teach these issues is in government is, and please stop me if I've said this already on your show, but is budgeting in government. For
Mhm.
anybody who's been in government and has had to manage a budget, they understand this concept pretty clearly. We talk about in government, we want to be, honest stewards and stewards of the people's money, taxpayer money. We want to be efficient, effective. We want to save money where we can. We don't. We
Mhm.
want to do all those things, and that's sort of the overall objective. And all of us want to do that. So let's say you've got $1,000 left in your particular unit's office supply account, and there's a month left before the end of the fiscal year, and you've got $1,000 sitting there. What do you do with that money?
You spend it as much as you can, as quickly as you can.
As every single penny. And it doesn't mean because you are trying to just waste money or do anything, but we have structural incentives in every single
Mm.
government entity, or disincentives to saving that money. Why? Because if you do, you're not keeping it for your budget the next year.
Right.
There's no carryover. There's no benefit to not spending it for things that you legitimately need. And not only that, you will say next year, well, I still need the money I got last year. And they say, no, 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 you didn't spend the $1,000. They'll actually cut your budget. So
Right.
we've created a system that develops a culture that is completely contrary to what we say we want. And there are a million examples of that. So you first have to look at that system, that structure. But I also think you have to look at the people. You
Yeah.
have to look at the leadership that truly embraces, and it's not just words, but through actions, and that you're bringing in the people and incentivizing the people and rewarding the people who embody the culture that you want. And that, I think, one of the sort of noble fights in government are the people who who try to personify and embody those objectives in spite of the structure in which they are in. Because that's one of the most frustrating things for many of us in government. We're trying to do the right thing, but then you have all these ridiculous barriers to achieving that, or contrary messaging that makes it difficult. Sometimes that bureaucracy, I have a different view of bureaucracy. Sometimes you need that bureaucracy because you want to make sure things are done correctly and lawfully, et cetera. But that's how you change culture, is not simply going to be just because the tone changes. That's a part of it. But you have to change these systems and cultures. We're not going to get the young officers who are going to be put in the right positions within a department who may have a different view of things. When you have a department, and many departments are like this, where the most important thing is seniority.
Yeah.
Right? How many years you have on the job? Because oftentimes in policing and other institutions, we equate experience with expertise or capability. Yeah. And that's a big mistake. And we do that based on seniority. And we embody that in the rules and regulations and the collective bargaining agreements, that so-and-so has preference for this job simply because they got into policing earlier than somebody else who may be much better qualified, may have the skills and capabilities that embody what a police department actually wants to do today.
Yeah. Yeah, that is so true. I've often said that with some of the senior people. It's like, you just started this job before me. But when you look at some of the current management and leadership, and you look at their age and you look at how much time they've been on the job, this is all they've done. I mean, this was their first job, and they've never worked in the private sector. They've never worked in the academic sector. So there's this idea of like, well, I've been doing this a long time. Yeah, but in the same place with the same people, reinforcing the same culture, reinforcing the same habits. And, like I always said, we're neck to ankle in wool in a desert climate, while every police agency has upgraded their uniform, and why? Because it's tradition, and it's like,
well, and also, you may have been doing it for a long time, but have you been doing it well, or the right way, or the way you want it done today? And those don't become factors. And then, and then also just leadership development. If you look at any other institution, I mean, the military is another example of this. They really do try to develop leaders across the board, both through education, through development, through evaluation, through coaching, through all of these different things. And we don't get that investment in policing leadership. Some departments do. I know one of the great experiences I had at LAPD was the Command Development School, which was taking people who were lieutenants who are on the list to potentially become captains and civilians to get together and develop that. There was the West Point leadership and other programs, but those are few and far between as a general matter. And they certainly aren't systematic in a way that you would expect in an agency that has such an incredible impact on communities.
So, you know what, you said this, and I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you this. How do you define leadership? What is that concept to you?
So to me, the concept of leadership is taking it. I mean, in a simplistic way, it's about the most effective way to achieve your mission and pursue your mission. And effective by meaning you're trying to get everyone in an organization together, aligned and contributing in their way to achieve some mission. That may be, whether it's in a factory, whether it's in policing, to do that. It's not about managing. Managing is an important skill, but that's about resources. You lead people. And that takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of introspection of yourself. It takes a lot of empathy. It takes a lot of education and understanding those things. It takes more humility than it does bravado or ego, I think. But ultimately, it's what is your mission? If your mission is to lead a police department, one, what is your objective, and how do you lead to that obviously being ethical, et cetera. But how do you lead the people to help accomplish that mission in the most effective way you can?
I like it. I'm glad I got to ask you that right off the cuff. I wrote it down, and I'm going to be using it again. So I want to be aware of your time. And I also, for the listeners, I want to make it, manageable for them. So I'm going to start wrapping up a little bit, but give us, I'm going to recap the 3 Ds the three dimensions of policing: law and constitution should be our foundation, and then the role of the people, the public, and then the role of the officers, and how those three things, would you say, intersect? How wrap it up one more time for us?
So I think the first dimension that I call, and let me just say, I think these are the three dimensions of effective policing in America. And I think that in America part is important, because how we define policing in America is different than you would in Canada, in Mexico, and any other country, because it's so much defined by our laws, the Constitution, our democratic values that are specific to America. Not that other democratic countries, but they have different types of democracies. We have a very specific way. So I just fundamentally think that in order to be effective as a police agency in America, we have to understand, we have to abide, and we have to appropriately and properly apply the law and the Constitution in doing the police work. It's not just the officers, but I'm talking about what are the expectations, why do we have police? They're there to fairly enforce the law, protect communities, and pursue justice on behalf of the people. Those things have to be consistent, embody, and properly apply the law and the Constitution. So those two dimensions are connected. But that third dimension is about the role of the people. And the people have more a role than just telling them what you're doing or listening to them once in a while. They have a very important role as police officers, as representatives of them. And that mutual responsibility, and I think it is those partnerships, that obligation to hold yourselves accountable on their behalf, being transparent and being engaged with them, is that third dimension that is not inconsistent or should not be in tension with the police work, and certainly is not in conflict with the Constitution, which actually requires it.
Perfect. And I had a text message come in. Somebody knew I was talking to you, and they said they wanted me to ask you this question because they know you're a kind of a constitutionalist among your many hats. When officers have to deal with individuals that say, well, you work for me, I'm the taxpayer, and I pay your salary, so you work for me. A lot of cops say, well, I'm a taxpayer too. So, like, am I an entrepreneur at this point? Because I'm paying for my salary. What would you tell these officers when they're standing on a line or something and somebody is just berating them saying, I pay your taxes, and they're trying to engage in a meaningful conversation, not just go tit for tat? What would you think would be a reasonable response to get that person to see both sides?
I think, well, one, I wouldn't make it about them personally, the officer, well, so do I. I think that's probably not the best way to do it. But you could say, yes, you pay taxes for me and for all of us to protect the community and fairly enforce the law, regardless of whether you're a taxpayer or not. Yeah, you do represent the taxpayer, but you represent all taxpayers, regardless of who they are, what race, what culture, what ethnicity, or what they do to fairly and justly enforce the law and protect all members of the community. So it is true, but that doesn't mean just because you're a taxpayer and you pay you partly pay for this, that I'm supposed to treat you somehow differently than I would everybody else, because I do represent, this badge represents, especially in the city of Los Angeles, is very emblematic. It has the picture of City Hall. What is City Hall? City Hall is the representative government of the city of Los Angeles. That's who it reflects. To protect and to serve is about to protect and to serve the public, but it's all the public, not just one individual. That
would be neat, because then when they're recording, the officer goes, look, I'm here to represent everybody. So yes, you are a part of everybody, but other people are as well, and they may have a different view than you do. And absolutely, in this moment, I have to do this particular assignment. So I think that gives them something to chew on, because it does turn into a tit for tat, and then they get these viral videos. So we're trying to teach officers how to respond intelligently and not emotionally to things like that.
And I think most departments, and I know LAPD, they're very much about, I represent more than myself. I represent the badge and I represent the LAPD. There's an identity there. Mm-hmm. I think the thing is extending that identity. It's not just the badge and the LAPD or even the city of Los Angeles. You're representing the community of Los Angeles, the government, the representative government of Los Angeles and the state. That means a lot more, and your responsibilities are more than just one individual. It's to everybody collectively. And of course, treating them all fairly, justly, and consistent with the law and our democratic values.
Yeah, that would be a neat response, and that would be a great that video
I'll
itself.
put it
would
on
get
a
lot of
card.
hits.
I'll put it on a card.
Absolutely, they can just pull out and say, "Well, sir," in response to your flippant comment. So, Arif, I really appreciate you coming on and doing this. I got pages of notes. I don't know if you can even see. I got pages of notes on everything you said, and I'm looking forward to having you come and educate myself and the young officers here soon on this constitutionality in policing. I think we're gonna skyrocket this, and it's gonna be pretty neat.
Well, I appreciate you having me on. It's always a pleasure, and I really appreciate the listeners who want to hear a little bit more detail and more nuance about these very challenging and important issues. And so I really appreciate the opportunity to give my thoughts and opinions.
Awesome. Well, we'll see you on round 3 here.
All right.
All right. Take care, sir.